They think this jungle will break us. They are wrong. We push through this ravine at dawn, and we show them what we're made of.
There's a battle that most people who know the Second World War have never heard of. It was fought in the jungles of Burma between 1944 and 1945. It involved more than 1 million men on both sides. It produced the largest land defeat ever suffered by the Imperial Japanese Army. It was won by a British general who rebuilt a broken, demoralized army from the inside out, who outthought and outmaneuvered one of the most capable Japanese commanders of the war, and who did all of this in one of the most inhospitable combat environments on the face of the earth. Triple canopy jungle, monsoon rains, rivers that flooded without warning, diseases that killed more men than the enemy did. The general was William Joseph Slim, Field Marshal Sir William Slim, 1st Viscount Slim, to give him his full post-war title. He commanded the 14th Army, which his men called the Forgotten Army, because that is what they were, in the Burma campaign from 1943 to 1945. He is, by the consensus of the military historians who have studied the Second World War with sufficient breadth to assess all of its theaters, one of the 2 or 3 finest commanders of the entire conflict. He is also, by common consent of the same historians, the least known of the war's great commanders, the man who achieved more with less against a more difficult enemy, in more difficult conditions, than almost any other general in any theater, and who has been systematically overlooked by the popular memory of the war because the theater he fought in was distant, difficult to romanticize, and strategically secondary to the European and Pacific theaters that dominate the war's popular narrative. This is the story of what Slim did in Burma, why it mattered, and why the fact that most people have never heard of it is itself a story worth telling. Before I go any further, I want to ask you directly, if you've been watching this series and you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. The final episode of this series is going to be about McAuliffe at Bastogne, about the single word that became the most famous answer in the history of American warfare, and about what actually cost the men who made that answer possible. That story is extraordinary, and it's coming soon. Subscribe now and hit the bell. And if this episode about the war that most people have forgotten gives you something, if it lands the way it should, hit the like button so the algorithm shows it to someone else who should know about William Slim. Back to Burma, back to the forgotten general and the war that nobody tells. The specific comparison between Slim's achievement and the achievements of the commanders who have received more attention from popular history is one that the military scholarship has been making for decades, and it is worth engaging with directly because it illuminates both Slim's specific qualities and the specific ways in which the popular memory of the war has been shaped by factors other than operational achievement. The comparison with Montgomery is the most instructive because Montgomery commanded in the European theater where the popular attention was concentrated, and because the contrast in command styles is so clear. Montgomery was cautious, methodical, and supremely attentive to his own reputation. A commander who rarely attacked without overwhelming material superiority and who managed the public record of his campaigns with the same care he brought to their planning. His victories at El Alamein and in the Normandy campaign were real and significant, and they were conducted with a professionalism that his detractors sometimes fail to acknowledge. But the specific comparison of what each commander achieved relative to the resources available and the difficulties faced suggests a more complex assessment than the attention each receives in popular history would imply. Montgomery commanded well-supplied, well-equipped armies in accessible terrain against an enemy whose strategic position was weakening throughout the campaigns he fought. Slim commanded a chronically under-resourced army in some of the most difficult terrain in the world against an enemy that had recently demonstrated its capacity to defeat British forces decisively. The specific achievements of each, assessed relative to what each had to work with and what each was up against, placed Slim's accomplishment in a different category from the favorable conditions that Montgomery operated in. The comparison with Patton is different in character. Patton and Slim shared certain qualities of command that the comparison illuminates, and the differences between them are as instructive as the similarities. Both were commanders of great operational talent who built armies that reflected their own personalities and whose achievements were shaped by those personalities. Both believed in the aggressive use of mobility and by the importance of maintaining operational tempo. Both were willing to accept risk in pursuit of opportunity. The differences were in character and in circumstance. Patton was theatrical, confrontational, and operated with resources that, while never as much as he wanted, were consistently more than Slim had available. Slim was thoughtful, humane, and operated with resources that were always inadequate to the demands of the campaign. Patton's genius expressed itself in the exploitation of breakthrough, in the racing armor across France that was his greatest operational achievement. Slim's genius expressed itself in the rebuilding of a broken army and the patient construction of the conditions that would eventually allow him to destroy a Japanese army in detail. Both were great commanders. The specific theater and the specific conditions in which each commanded make direct comparison difficult. What the comparison does suggest is that Slim's achievement in the specific conditions he faced was at least as demanding and at least as significant as anything Patton accomplished, and that the difference in the attention they receive has more to do with the glamour of their respective theaters than with the relative quality of their generalship. The comparison with Eisenhower is perhaps the most useful, because Eisenhower and Slim faced similar problems at different scales. The problem of managing a coalition, of sustaining morale in a difficult campaign, of making operational decisions that balanced what was achievable against what was required. Eisenhower was managing a coalition of nations whose interests were not always compatible, in a theater that was at the center of Allied strategic attention, with resources that were the primary focus of Allied industrial production. Slim was managing a coalition of nationalities in a theater that was consistently the lowest priority for Allied resources, making operational decisions that had to account for what air supply could and could not achieve and for specific ways that the Burmese terrain constrained conventional logistics. Both were coalition commanders of exceptional skill. Both understood that their primary task was not the operational art battle, though both were accomplished at that, but the political and organizational art of making a diverse coalition function as an effective fighting force. The specific ways each accomplished this: Eisenhower through patience and consensus building, Slim through personal presence and a specific kind of communication that reached soldiers across cultural and linguistic boundaries, reflect their different circumstances and their different personalities. The institutional recognition that each has received is wildly asymmetrical. Eisenhower became President of the United States, the most visible possible acknowledgement of the esteem in which his wartime service was held. Slim became Governor General of Australia, an important position, but not one that placed him in the same historical visibility as Eisenhower's subsequent career. The specific difference in their post-war recognitions reflects, in part, the difference in the theaters they commanded. The European theater was at the center of American strategic attention, while the Burma theater was consistently at its margins. The soldiers of the 14th Army, the Forgotten Army, experienced a version of this asymmetry throughout the war and in its aftermath. Their campaign received less press coverage, less public attention, less political acknowledgement than the campaigns in Europe and Pacific. When the war ended and the veterans came home, the Burma veterans found that the people they returned to had less clear sense of what they had been doing and where they had been doing it than the veterans of other theaters found. This is the specific injustice of the Forgotten Army. Not that it fought badly or achieved less, but that what it fought for and what it achieved has been systematically less acknowledged than comparable achievements in more visible theaters. The specific corrective to this injustice is to tell the story accurately and completely, to give the Burma campaign and the soldiers who fought it and the general who led them the specific acknowledgement that the popular memory of the war has failed to provide. That is what this episode has tried to do. Slim was the best general most people have never heard of. The Forgotten Army was one of the finest fighting forces of the war. The Burma campaign was one of the most demanding and most decisively successful campaigns of the entire conflict. All three of these facts deserve to be part of the common knowledge of the Second World War. They are not yet, but they should be. And the specific human beings who made them true, who rebuilt from defeat, who held at Kohima, who crossed the Irrawaddy and took Mandalay and drove the Japanese out of Burma, deserve to be remembered with the same clarity and the same pride that the soldiers of El Alamein and Normandy and Midway are remembered. The Forgotten Army won. William Slim made it possible. The story deserves to be told. The broader context of the Burma campaign, the strategic significance of the theater, and the specific reasons why it has received so little attention in the popular memory of the war is worth examining because it illuminates both what Slim achieved and why the achievement has been so consistently overlooked. Burma occupied a peculiar strategic position in the Second World War. From the British perspective, it was a colonial territory whose recovery mattered for both strategic and imperial reasons. Strategically, because it sat astride the supply route to China, and because its loss gave Japan a land bridge to India, and imperially, because the fall of Burma had been part of the catastrophic loss of British prestige in Asia that the Japanese offensives of 1941 to 42 had produced. The recovery of Burma was essential to the restoration of the British Empire's position in Asia. From the American perspective, Burma mattered primarily as a supply route. The hump airlift over the Himalayas from India to China, and the road building that produced the Lido Road connecting India to China via Burma were the American strategic priorities in the theater. Keeping China in the war, keeping Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government fighting, and thereby tying down Japanese forces that might otherwise be deployed elsewhere, was the primary American interest in the theater, and Burma's relevance was largely logistical. From a Japanese perspective, Burma was a defensive barrier against Allied counterattack, a buffer that gave Japan strategic depth in Southeast Asia, and that, in Mutaguchi's vision, could become the springboard for an advance into India that would knock Britain out of the Asian War. None of these strategic frameworks gave Burma the kind of central importance that the European theater had for the Western Allies or the Central Pacific had for the Americans. The theater was secondary in each country's strategic hierarchy, and the resources allocated to it reflected this secondary status. Slim fought the Burma campaign with what he could get, which was consistently less than what other theaters received, less than what the campaign's demands required, and less than what the men fighting it deserved. The specific resentment that the soldiers of the 14th Army felt about being the forgotten army was not simply psychological sensitivity. It was a specific reaction to the specific reality that the rest of the war seemed to be receiving more attention, more resources, and more recognition than what was happening in Burma. The theater was physically distant from the centers of Allied strategic decision-making. The press coverage was minimal compared to the European and Pacific theaters. The supply of equipment and reinforcements was consistently lower priority than other demands on Allied industrial and logistical capacity. Slim managed these constraints with the same patience and intelligence that characterized everything he did. He learned to work with what he had, to develop solutions that compensated for the resource deficiencies, and to present to his men a picture of the campaign that emphasized what they were accomplishing rather than what they were lacking. His specific gift for speaking to soldiers, for finding the words that would sustain their morale under conditions that would have broken a less well-led force, was never more essential than in the 14th Army, where the combination of material deprivation and institutional neglect created a constant threat to fighting effectiveness. The specific operational innovations that Slim developed for the Burma campaign, the use of air supply to sustain forces in positions that conventional logistics could not reach, the development of tactical doctrine that treated the jungle as cover rather than obstacle, the integration of the air-ground team that allowed close support of infantry operations in terrain that conventional observation and communication could not cover, were innovations that had applications beyond the Burma theater. The specific lessons of the Burma campaign about air supply and jungle warfare influenced Allied planning and operations in other theaters and contributed to the general development of combined arms doctrine in the post-war period. But the innovations, however significant, are less important than the specific achievement they made possible: the destruction of the Japanese Burma Area Army in the campaign of 1944 to 45. The scale of this achievement, 100,000 Japanese casualties at Info-Kohima alone, the subsequent liberation of Burma, the complete defeat of the Japanese military force that had conquered the territory in 1942, was commensurate with the achievements of any other campaign of the war. It was achieved in conditions that were more difficult than any other theater, with resources that were consistently lower priority than other theaters received, and it was led by a commander who was working to rebuild and sustain an army that had been broken by defeat and neglect. The specific men who fought the Burma campaign who carried it from the catastrophe of 1942 to the victory of 1945, deserve specific acknowledgement alongside the men of the more celebrated campaigns. They were soldiers from across the British Commonwealth and the Indian Empire, British infantry regiments, Indian battalions, Gurkha riflemen, African soldiers from East and West Africa, American combat units operating with the Chinese Army in India under General Stilwell. They fought in conditions that included temperature extremes, monsoon rains that turned the jungle tracks into rivers of mud, diseases that kill without regard for tactical skill or physical courage, and the specific fear of a Japanese enemy, who gave no quarter and expected none. The Gurkha soldiers of the campaign deserve specific mention because their contribution was both extraordinary and systematically underrepresented in the popular accounts that have been written. The Gurkha regiments of the Indian Army were among the finest infantry in the world, soldiers from the hill country of Nepal who brought a specific combination of physical endurance, tactical aggression, and personal courage that made them effective in exactly the conditions of the Burma campaign. Their losses in the campaign were substantial, and their achievements were essential to the operations that Slim planned. The Indian soldiers who made up the majority of the 14th Army's strength were fighting for a country that was still a British colony, fighting under British officers for an empire that their leaders were simultaneously demanding independence from. The specific political complexity of the situation: Indian soldiers dying for British imperial interests while the Indian National Congress was demanding Britain leave India, is one of the dimensions of the Burma campaign that the popular memory has been slowest to fully engage with. The Indian soldiers' specific motivations for fighting, regimental loyalty, personal honor, economic necessity, and in many cases a genuine belief in the Allied cause, were diverse and complicated, and they are part of the full story of what the 14th Army was. Slim understood this complexity. He led an army of multiple nationalities and multiple motivations with consistency of respect and acknowledgement that was itself a form of leadership, a recognition that the men he was commanding were not simply instruments of British imperial policy, but human beings whose specific dignity and specific contributions deserved specific recognition. The specific way he addressed his soldiers, the language he used, the respect he showed, the directness with which he told them the truth about their situation, was calibrated to reach men from very different backgrounds with a consistent message that they were valued and that what they were doing mattered. The campaign he led them to win was one of the greatest achievements of the Second World War. It has been overlooked by the popular memory of the war because the theater was distant and the strategic importance was secondary. It deserves to be remembered because the achievement was real and the soldiers who accomplished it were real, and what they did was extraordinary. William Slim was the best general most people have never heard of. The men of the forgotten army deserve to be less forgotten. This is a story that says so, and that invites you to hold it alongside the stories of Eisenhower at Normandy and Patton on the road to Germany and Nimitz at Midway as one of the essential stories of the war that most people know too little about. He rebuilt an army. He destroyed a Japanese army. He liberated Burma. He did it in conditions that most generals would have found impossible. And he did it as a forgotten general of the forgotten theater, without the recognition that the achievement deserved and that this episode tries, in its limited way, to provide. The forgotten Army won. It deserves to be remembered. The specific Battle of Kohima, which stood alongside Impal as a decisive engagement of the Burma campaign, deserves examination in its own right, because it is one of the most remarkable small unit actions of the entire war, and because it illustrates the specific character of the campaign that Slim was fighting. Kohima was a hill station in the Naga Hills on the road between Impal and the Indian railhead at Dimapur. It sat at a crossroads that the Japanese needed to control in order to isolate the Impal garrison and cut the supply route into Burma. The garrison defending it when the Japanese besieged it in April 1944 was approximately 2,500 men, a mix of British and Indian infantry, plus a garrison battalion of recent recruits who had received minimal combat training. Against this garrison, the Japanese committed a full division. The battle that followed lasted for 2 weeks and was fought across terrain so small that the opposing forces were sometimes within hand grenade range of each other, sometimes within arm's reach. The most famous specific location was the tennis court of the district commissioner's bungalow, where the perimeter ran directly across the court, and both sides fought from their respective ends of the net. The men who defended Kohima did so with a tenacity that the specific conditions of the battle, close quarters, constant Japanese pressure, mounting casualties, diminishing supplies, required them to find somewhere in themselves that their previous experience had not demanded. They were not the elite troops who had been trained for exactly this kind of fight. They were, in many cases, soldiers who had been in Burma for months without adequate rest, supply, or medical support. They held because they had a specific regimental tradition to uphold, and because of specific knowledge of what the Japanese did to soldiers who surrendered provided powerful motivation not to. The relief of Kohima came in the second week of April, when the British 2nd Division broke through the Japanese roadblock south of Dimapur and fought its way up the Kohima Road to relieve the garrison. The fighting to clear the Japanese from the Kohima Ridge continued for weeks after the initial relief. The Japanese had dug in thoroughly, and the battle for the specific terrain features of the ridge was conducted with the same intensity and the same cost that the siege itself had required. The Kohima Memorial, which stands at the top of the ridge above the town, bears one of the most widely quoted epitaphs of the war. When you go home, tell them of us and say, "For your tomorrow we gave our today." The words were written by John Maxwell Edmonds, an English classicist, and they are set in stone at the cemetery where the men who died at Kohima are buried. The specific form of the address, the dead speaking to the living, asking only to be remembered, is the appropriate expression for a battle that asked everything of the men who fought it and that the subsequent history of the war gave too little attention. Slim understood Kohima's importance from the beginning. He had positioned the forces and established the supply arrangements that allowed both Kohima and Impel to hold, and his response to the battle's development, to reinforce and to plan the counterstroke that would exploit the Japanese overextension, with the operational intelligence that turned a defensive crisis into the decisive victory of the Burma campaign. The specific insight that distinguished Slim's operational planning at Info Kohima was his reading of the Japanese logistics. Mutaguchi's operation had been planned on the assumption that the Japanese forces would capture Allied stores within the first weeks of the offensive and use those stores to sustain the continued advance. The specific calculation that the Japanese could live off the land and off captured supplies in a way that their own supply system could not provide was a logic that made the operation seem viable despite its logistical inadequacy. Slim understood this logic and understood its vulnerability. The captured stores at Impel would not be available to Mutaguchi if the Impel garrison held and was resupplied by air. If the garrison held and the supply lines were maintained by air, Mutaguchi's forces would face a siege with no clear end date and with diminishing supplies. The Japanese were not carrying enough food and ammunition to sustain a siege of weeks or months. They had been issued minimal rations and told to capture what they needed. If there was nothing to capture, they would starve. The air supply that sustained the Impel garrison through the siege, the American and British transport aircraft that flew thousands of sorties across the Naga Hills to keep the besieged force fed and armed, was a specific logistical innovation that made Slim's plan work. Without the air supply, the plan would have been impossible. The ability to supply a large garrison entirely by air for months had not been demonstrated before on this scale in this theater. Slim was betting the battle on its feasibility. It was feasible. The air supply worked. The garrison held, and Mutaguchi's forces ran out of food and ammunition and began to disintegrate before the siege was broken. The pursuit that followed was not a pursuit of a defeated army. It was a following up of a dying one. The Japanese soldiers retreating toward the Chindwin were dying of starvation and disease at a rate that made the battle's specific combat casualties look almost secondary. Men who had marched into Manipur in March with their units' full complement were dying in the jungle in July with nothing left, no food, no medicine, no hope. Mutaguchi was relieved of command. He was brought before a court of inquiry after the war that examined the planning and execution of Operation Yugo. The court found that the operation had been reckless in its logistics from the beginning, that the assumption of capturing Allied stores had never been a reliable basis for a major offensive, and that the specific failure to adequately anticipate the role that air supply would play in sustaining the Impel garrison had been a fundamental error in the operational concept. Slim's reading of the campaign, expressed in his memoir Defeat into Victory, was characteristically generous in some respects and characteristically sharp in others. He acknowledged the quality of the Japanese soldier, the tenacity, the physical endurance, the tactical skill, that the Japanese infantry demonstrated throughout the Burma campaign. He was equally clear about the Japanese command system's specific weakness, a command culture that rewarded aggression and punished caution in ways that led to operations like Yugo, which were bold in their conception and potentially disastrous in their logistics, and that were executed with a determination that turned into fanaticism when the operation began to go wrong. The Japanese soldier at Kohima and Imphal demonstrated a specific kind of courage, the courage to continue advancing against impossible odds, to continue attacking fortified positions with diminishing resources, to die for an operation whose logistics had already determined its outcome. This courage was real, and it deserves acknowledgement. It was also a specific form of the military culture that had produced the kamikaze and the banzai charge, a culture in which the individual soldier's willingness to die was treated as a substitute for the operational planning and the logistical preparation that would have given him a realistic chance of survival. The specific cost of this culture in the Burma campaign was measured in the 53,000 Japanese dead of Operation Yugo, men who had done everything their culture asked of them and who died because the operation that their culture had designed for them was logistically impossible, and because their commanders had not been honest with themselves or with their soldiers about what the operation required. The men of the 14th Army who fought at Kohima and Imphal, who held the perimeter when the Japanese were at the wire, who flew the supply missions through the monsoon clouds, who broke through the roadblock and relieved the garrison, were fighting with adequate logistics, adequate medical support, adequate tactical doctrine, and adequate leadership. The contrast between what the two sides brought to the battle is part of what makes Imphal Kohima so instructive as a study in military effectiveness. Slim made his army effective by addressing every dimension of its effectiveness simultaneously: the tactical, the operational, the logistical, the medical, and the psychological. No other theater commander of the war addressed the problem of rebuilding a broken army as comprehensively as Slim did, and the specific results, an army that went from the longest retreat in British military history to the largest defeat ever suffered by the Japanese army in the space of 3 years, are the evidence of what comprehensive, patient, intelligent leadership can achieve. The specific soldiers who carried out this achievement, the British, Indian, Gurkha, and African soldiers of the 14th Army, deserve to be named alongside the armies of any other theater when the accomplishments of the Second World War are assessed. They fought in conditions that the armies of other theaters did not face. They achieved results that the armies of other theaters would have been proud of. They were called the Forgotten Army during the war, and they have remained the Forgotten Army in the popular memory of the war since. Slim tried to correct this in his memoir and in his public statements after the war. He argued, with the quiet persistence that characterized his approach to everything, that the Burma campaign mattered, that it had destroyed a Japanese army that would otherwise have had to be destroyed somewhere else, at some other cost, and that the specific men who had done the destroying deserved to be remembered for what they had accomplished. He was right. They do. And the fact that this episode is the first many people have encountered the name William Slim is the specific evidence that the forgetting he tried to prevent has continued, and that the corrective he tried to provide has not been adequate to scale the neglect. The Forgotten Army is still forgotten. The Forgotten General is still largely unknown outside the community of military historians who know the Second World War in its full scope. This episode is one attempt to begin correcting that, to tell the story that the popular memory of the war has consistently failed to tell, and to honor the soldiers and the commander who made it. William Slim was born in Bristol in 1891, the son of a hardware merchant, and he had no particular military pedigree. He had attended good schools, but not the elite military academies that produce most of Britain's senior commanders. He had served in the First World War as an infantry officer, had been wounded at Gallipoli, had recovered, had fought in Mesopotamia, and had ended the war with a reputation for competence and resilience and a military cross that documented his courage in a campaign that the British military establishment preferred not to think about too carefully. The interwar years had been spent in the Indian Army, the British officered Indian recruited force that was a primary military instrument of the British Empire in Asia. The Indian Army was not the prestigious career path for ambitious British officers. It was the path that men took when they needed a career and could not afford the expensive social obligations of the British Army's more fashionable regiments. Slim went to the Indian Army because it was what was available to a man of his background and his means. He became, in the years he spent there, one of the finest officers in it. The specific qualities that made Slim exceptional were not the qualities that military tradition tends to celebrate first. He was not a dashing figure. He was not glamorous in the way that Patton was glamorous, or MacArthur was theatrical, or Rommel was legendarily aggressive. He was a solid, thoughtful, deeply intelligent man who read voraciously, thought carefully about everything he read, and applied what he learned to the specific problems of commanding soldiers in difficult conditions. He was also, by all accounts, one of the most genuinely humane commanders of the war, a man who understood that soldiers were people first and instruments of policy second, and who led accordingly. His humor was famous in the 14th Army. He had a gift for speaking to soldiers, for finding exactly the words that would reach the exhausted, sick, demoralized infantryman at the end of a long march and tell him, convincingly, why what he was doing mattered and how it was going to end. He made himself visible to his men in ways that larger ego commanders sometimes neglected. He traveled constantly, visited units in the most remote positions, ate the same food, and endured the same conditions, and gave men the specific experience of being seen and acknowledged by the person responsible for their lives. The 14th Army that Slim inherited when he took command in 1943 was in crisis. It had suffered two catastrophic retreats: the fall of Burma in 1942, when the Japanese had driven the British forces out of Burma, in the longest retreat in British military history, and the disastrous First Arakan campaign of 1942-43, in which the attempt to retake the Burmese coastline had been repulsed with heavy casualties, and had further damaged the Army's confidence in its own ability to fight the Japanese. The crisis was not simply military. It was psychological and institutional. The soldiers of the 14th Army, British, Indian, Gurkha, African, had come to believe that the Japanese were somehow superior in jungle warfare, that the specific conditions of Burma favored the attacker who had mastered those conditions, and that the British and Indian forces had not mastered them and might not be capable of doing so. They had been defeated. They had been sick. Malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases were killing more men than the fighting, and they had not had adequate medical support. They had been inadequately supplied, inadequately trained for jungle warfare, and inadequately led at several levels of command. Slim addressed all of these problems simultaneously, which is itself a remarkable accomplishment. He reformed the medical system, establishing a malaria discipline that would eventually reduce disease casualties from the epidemic proportions of 1942-43 to manageable levels. He retrained the Army for jungle warfare, developing and disseminating the tactical doctrine that recognized the jungle as a medium to be used rather than feared, that the same close terrain that had seemed to favor the Japanese could be used by a force that understood it. He changed the supply system, working with the Americans who were building a logistics capability in the theater to ensure that his army had what it needed to fight. And he addressed the psychological problem directly, through the specific form of personal leadership that his character made possible. The Kohima campaign of 1944, the battle that is the center of the Burma story, was both the greatest crisis of the 14th Army and its greatest triumph. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, launched Operation Yugo in March 1944, a massive offensive designed to drive into India through the Manipur Hills, cut the supply lines to the Allied forces in Burma, and potentially set off a revolt against British rule in India that would knock Britain out of the Asian War. Mutaguchi had the agreement of the Japanese Army leadership and the specific support of Subhas Chandra Bose's Indian National Army, the force of Indian nationalist soldiers fighting under Japanese command for Indian independence. The plan was bold to the point of recklessness. Mutaguchi was proposing to advance 3 divisions across difficult terrain and lay siege to Imphal, the main Allied supply base in Manipur, while flanking force cut the road at Kohima, a small hill station on the main supply route from India into Burma. The logistics of the operation were marginal. The Japanese were advancing too fast for their supply system to support, relying on captured Allied stores to sustain the assault. The plan assumed that the Allied forces would break under pressure, that Imphal would fall quickly, and that the captured stores would supply the Japanese forces for the next phase of the offensive into India. Slim saw what was coming. His intelligence was good enough to identify the approximate timing and direction of the Japanese attack, and his reading of Japanese operational patterns, the specific signature of a Japanese commander who believed that speed and aggression could substitute for logistics, told him that the offensive would outrun its supply lines if the Allied forces could hold out long enough. He made a decision that was controversial at the time and that has been discussed by military historians as one of the finest pieces of operational planning of the war. He decided to let the Japanese attack, to absorb the blow inside, prepare defensive positions at Imphal, and to rely on air supply to keep the Imphal garrison fed and armed while the Japanese forces around it slowly starved. This decision required accepting a siege, allowing the Japanese to surround Imphal while the road to India was cut, and trusting that the air supply could sustain the garrison through the weeks or months that the siege would last. It also required an act of physical courage at Kohima that Slim had not fully planned for. The Japanese force at Kohima was larger than the intelligence had suggested, and the small garrison that was subjected to one of the most intense close-quarters battles of the entire war. 2 weeks of fighting across a tennis court, on the grounds of the district commissioner's bungalow, in conditions of extreme violence and extreme courage by both sides. Kohima held. The relief column broke through, and Imphal, supplied by air throughout the siege, held as well. When the relief forces reached Imphal in late June 1944, and the siege was broken, the Japanese forces around it were in catastrophic condition. Mutaguchi's 3 divisions had been fighting for months without adequate food, without adequate ammunition, without adequate medical support. The disease that afflicted the Japanese forces was even worse than what the 14th Army had faced in its own crisis years: cholera, dysentery, malaria, and the combination of disease and combat losses had reduced the Japanese divisions to fractions of their original strength. The pursuit that Slim ordered after the siege was broken was as decisive as any operation of the war. The Japanese forces retreating from Imphal and Kohima were not simply withdrawing. They were disintegrating. Men were dying of starvation and disease as they retreated. The roads they had advanced on in March were littered with Japanese bodies by July. The jungle that Mutaguchi had believed would protect his offensive became the graveyard of his army. Operation Yugo had begun with approximately 100,000 Japanese soldiers. By the time the remnants had retreated back across the Chindwin River, approximately 53,000 of them were dead, killed in combat or dead of disease and starvation. Another 23,000 had been wounded. It was the greatest defeat in the history of the Japanese army, a defeat more costly, in terms of total casualties suffered, than any other single Japanese ground operation of the war. The force that had been supposed to break through to India had been destroyed. Slim then did something that distinguished him from many of the war's other great commanders. He did not stop. He had beaten Mutaguchi's offensive. He now launched his own. The 14th Army crossed the Chindwin and advanced into Burma in the autumn of 1944 and the winter of 1945 in a campaign of extraordinary operational creativity, a campaign that used the same principles of air supply and tactical flexibility that had sustained Imphal to project the army deep into the Japanese defensive system before the Japanese commanders could reorganize from the catastrophe of Imphal-Kohima. The specific operational achievement of the 14th Army's advance across the Irrawaddy and the capture of Mandalay in March 1945, followed by the rapid advance on Rangoon that drove the remaining Japanese forces out of Burma before the monsoon closed the campaign, was a sustained demonstration of what an army rebuilt from crisis and led by a commander of exceptional skill could accomplish. The Japanese forces in Burma never recovered from Imphal-Kohima. They were fighting the 14th Army's advance with diminishing resources, diminishing air support, and the knowledge that the Pacific Campaign was going so badly that reinforcement from other theaters was impossible. Slim kept the pressure on throughout. He did not give the Japanese the pause they needed to consolidate. He did not wait for perfect conditions or complete supply. He assessed what his army could do and found that it could do more than the cautious calculation suggested, that the specific combination of air supply and tactical mobility that he had developed allowed operations that would have been logistically impossible for a more conventionally supplied force. The fall of Rangoon in May 1945 completed the liberation of Burma. The campaign had taken approximately 2 years from Slim's assumption of command to its successful conclusion. It had destroyed the Japanese Burma Area Army as a fighting force. It had done so in conditions, the terrain, the climate, the distances, the disease, that made it one of the most operationally demanding campaigns of the entire war. The 14th Army that won this campaign was not the army that had retreated from Burma in 1942. It was a rebuilt army, retrained and re-equipped, and above all reled led by a man who had understood that the Army's problem was partly tactical and operational and partly psychological and institutional, and who had addressed all of these problems simultaneously over 2 years of patient, sustained work. The soldiers who crossed the Irrawaddy and took Mandalay were soldiers who believed in themselves and in their commander in a way that the soldiers who had retreated to India in 1942 had not. Slim died in 1970 at the age of 79. He had served as chief of the Imperial General Staff after the war, and then as Governor General of Australia. The same range of post-war achievement that marked the careers of several of Britain's finest wartime commanders, whose military excellence translated into distinguished civilian service. The contrast between his historical standing and that of the commanders he equaled or exceeded in operational achievement, Patton, Montgomery, Rommel, is striking and revealing. Slim is not celebrated in films or in popular history with anything approaching the attention given to these figures. The Burma campaign is not a subject of the same popular fascination as the North Africa campaign, or the Normandy campaign, or the Pacific Island battles. The theater was distant, the terrain was unglamorous, and the enemy, the Japanese army in Burma, is less familiar to Western audiences than the German army in Europe. But the achievement was real, and the historical record supports the assessment that Slim was among the finest commanders of the war. His rebuilding of a broken army, his operational planning for Inflicting, his exploitation of the Japanese defeat, and his sustained advance through Burma in 1944 and 1945 constitute a body of operational achievement that compares favorably with anything accomplished by the commanders who have received more attention from popular history. The Forgotten Army won. The Forgotten General made it possible. And the specific human cost of the campaign, the casualties on both sides, the disease that killed as many as the fighting, the specific suffering of the men who fought in the Burmese jungle for years while the rest of the world paid attention to other theaters, deserves to be acknowledged alongside the operational achievement that Slim's command produced. He was the best general most people have never heard of. This series has tried to make that harder to say. If it has succeeded, subscribe, share, and stay for the final episode. McAuliffe is coming, the most famous single word in American military history, and the cost of saying it. The specific operational sequence of the Burma campaign after Inflicting, the advance that Slim launched in the autumn and winter of 1944 to 45 that eventually liberated the country, is worth examining in some detail because it demonstrates the specific qualities of Slim's command that the crisis of Imphal had revealed and that the subsequent advance confirmed. The 14th Army crossed the Chindwin River in November 1944 and advanced into the central Burma plain against a Japanese defense that was conducting an ordered withdrawal toward the Irrawaddy River. The Japanese commander in Burma, General Hoitaro Kimura, had replaced Mutaguchi and had correctly assessed the situation. His forces were outnumbered, outmatched in firepower, and increasingly cut off from reinforcement and supply. His strategy was to defend the line of the Irrawaddy, the last major natural obstacle before Rangoon, and inflict the maximum possible casualties on the British advance while the situation in the Pacific Theater was resolved. Slim's response to this assessment was one of the most creative operational plans of the war. He recognized that Kimura would expect him to make his main crossing of the Irrawaddy in the north, where the river was narrower and where the most direct route to Mandalay lay. He planned a deception, a feint at the northern crossing that would draw Kimura's attention and reserves northward, while the real main effort crossed the river far to south of Pakaku and drove east to cut the road and railway south of Mandalay, isolating the Japanese forces defending the city. The operation, called Extended Capital, was a sophisticated piece of operational deception that required Slim to maintain the appearance of making his main crossing the north while secretly moving the bulk of his armored forces south for the real crossing. The logistics of this movement, shifting entire corps across hundreds of miles of jungle track while maintaining the deception, were a challenge that tested the administrative machinery that Slim had been building since he took command. The crossing succeeded. Kimura was deceived. The Japanese forces defending Mandalay found themselves with their supply lines cut and a British armored corps advancing on Maiktala, the logistical hub on which the Japanese defense of Mandalay depended, from the south. The Battle of Maiktala in March 1945 was a decisive engagement of the final Burma campaign. The 14th Army's armor and infantry seized the town, established a defensive perimeter against the Japanese counterattacks that followed, and held while the Japanese exhausted their remaining strength in futile attacks to retake it. Mandalay fell to the northern wing of the 14th Army simultaneously with the Mykdala battle. The Japanese forces in central Burma were caught between two British forces with their logistical base destroyed. Their options were to fight to the end in place or to attempt to break out toward the east. Most attempted to break out. Most died in the attempt, killed in the jungle as they tried to cross the Sitang River to reach Thailand, or dying of starvation and disease in the weeks of withdrawal that followed. The advance to Rangoon. The monsoon was coming, and the city needed to be taken before the rains made the roads impassable. Required Slim to push his forces at maximum speed over 400 miles in 6 weeks. The amphibious landing at Rangoon from the sea, Operation Dracula, which arrived just as the overland forces were approaching, found the city already evacuated by the Japanese. The monsoon arrived. The campaign was over. Burma had been liberated. The Japanese Burma Area Army had been destroyed. The road to China was secured. The campaign that had begun with the longest retreat in British military history had ended with one of the most decisive defeats ever inflicted on a Japanese army. Slim's specific contribution to this outcome: the rebuilding, the operational planning, the specific insight about Japanese logistics that had shaped Info Kohima, the creative deception of extended capital, was a decisive factor in the campaign's success. Without his command, the 14th Army that had retreated from Burma in 1942 might have continued to struggle in the jungles without finding the combination of leadership and doctrine that turned it into the force that won in 1945. He was not alone. The soldiers who fought were extraordinary. The administrative staff who kept the army supplied were essential. The American transport pilots who flew the hump and the supply missions to the Impo garrison were irreplaceable. The specific support of Admiral Mountbatten, the Supreme Commander Southeast Asia, in advocating for resources and political support for the theater was important. The campaign was won by many people, but it was shaped by one man's specific qualities of mind and character more than by any other single factor. Slim understood the problem, the military, institutional, psychological, and operational problem of the Burma campaign, more completely than anyone else. And he addressed it more systematically, more patiently, and more effectively than any commander faced with a comparable challenge in any theater of the war. The forgotten army won. William Slim made it possible. The men who held Kohima and crossed the Irrawaddy deserve to be remembered alongside the soldiers of Normandy and Midway. Their story is part of the essential story of the Second World War. The specific post-war recognition that Slim received, the peerage, the field marshalcy, the governor-generalship of Australia, was genuine and significant, and it reflected the esteem of those within the military and political establishment who understood what he had accomplished. The chief of the Imperial General Staff appointment, which he held from 1948 to 1952, placed him at the apex of the British military hierarchy. The governor-generalship of Australia was a distinguished post that gave him an important role in the post-war Commonwealth. But none of this translated into the kind of popular recognition that his achievement warranted. The public in Britain and in the Commonwealth countries whose soldiers had fought in Burma had been paying attention to Europe and the Pacific during the war. The Burma campaign had been covered inadequately by the press and had been understood inadequately by the public. The victory that ended it, decisive, complete, one of the most successful campaigns of the war, had not been celebrated in the same way that D-Day or El Alamein or the fall of Berlin had been celebrated. This specific gap between the achievement and the recognition was one that Slim himself was too modest to press. His memoir, Defeat into Victory, published in 1956, is one of the finest military memoirs in the English language, clear, honest, analytically sharp, and generous in its acknowledgement of the contributions of the many people who made the campaign's success possible. It is not a book that argues for Slim's own importance or demands that the reader acknowledge his genius. It is a book that tells the story of the campaign as clearly and honestly as the author can tell it, and that asks only that the reader understand what the men of the 14th Army accomplished. The book has been in print continuously since its publication. It is considered essential reading in military staff colleges around the world. It is cited by historians of the Second World War with a frequency that reflects its value as both a primary source and a piece of analytical military writing. It has not become the popular classic that the Burma campaign, properly understood, deserves to have the soldiers of the 14th Army. The men whose story Slim was trying to tell have aged and died in the decades since the war. The last of the Kohima veterans, the last of the Imphal garrison, the last of the men who crossed the Irrawaddy and took Mandalay. They are mostly gone now, as the World War II generation is mostly gone. Their specific memories of the campaign, the smells of the jungle, the specific sounds of the monsoon, the particular quality of the fear and the relief and the fatigue of months in Burma, are no longer retrievable from living people. What remains is the record, the memoirs and the official histories and the regimental histories, and the oral history collections that were assembled before the veterans were gone. And what remains in the landscape is the Kohima Memorial, with its epitaph asking that the dead be remembered, and the cemeteries where the men of the 14th Army and the men of the Japanese Burma Area Army are buried in the soil of a country that has been independent since 1948, and that carries its own relationship to the history of the campaign fought on its territory. Burma, now Myanmar, has a complicated relationship to the British imperial history, of which the Second World War campaign was a final chapter. The liberation that the 14th Army achieved was, from one perspective, the restoration of British colonial rule over a country that had been promised independence. From another perspective, it was a defeat of a Japanese occupation that had also been a colonial occupation, however different in its specific character from the British presence that preceded it. The Burmese population had experienced both, and its own memory of the war is shaped by both. The specific men and women of Burma who supported the Allied campaign, the Kachin and Karen and Chin irregular forces who provided intelligence and guided Allied columns through terrain that only they fully understood, the Burmese civilians who fed and sheltered Allied soldiers at personal risk, the specific individuals whose contribution to the campaign has been even less recognized than the contribution of the 14th Army soldiers, are part of the full story of the Burma campaign that has been least told. Slim understood this. His account of the Kachin and Karen irregulars, of the specific human relationships built across cultural and linguistic barriers in the specific conditions of the Burma jungle, are some of the most striking passages in his memoir. He understood that the campaign was fought in Burma by a British and Indian and African American army, in relationship with Burmese, people whose own interests and whose own courage were essential to the outcome. The acknowledgement of this dimension of the campaign is part of what makes his memoir one of the essential documents of the war. The Forgotten Army is less forgotten today than it was in 1945. The specific work of military historians, the availability of the memoir, the occasional television documentary, and the specific advocacy of veterans organizations have kept the Burma campaign's memory alive in ways that the immediate post-war period did not provide, but it remains substantially less known than comparable campaigns in other theaters, and the specific recognition that Slim's achievement deserves has not been adequately provided by the popular memory of the war. This episode is one attempt to provide some of what is owed. The story has been told. The achievement has been acknowledged. The forgotten general and the forgotten army have been named and their specific accomplishment described. They deserve more than one episode. They deserve a place in the common knowledge of the Second World War equal to their achievement. The achievement was extraordinary. The forgetting should end. The forgotten army should be forgotten no longer.